You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast. I have Stephen Gray. He's the head of Spirit Plant Medicine, and he organizes the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference. The website is spiritplantmedicine.com in Vancouver. So, Stephen, thanks for coming. How are you doing today?
Oh, very well, thanks.
Well, good. Tell me, what's the premise of the conference and your whole effort? How did you get into this realm?
Well, it depends on how far back you want to go. I'll confess my age right off the bat. I'm just turned 70, so I've been around since the infamous late 60s, people say the 60s, or late 60s, early 70s. I was very interested in these two dovetailing streams that were quite prominent, particularly in what was known as the counterculture at the time, of an interest in spirituality and in psychedelics. There is no coincidence that the two of them were working alongside each other. And, one thing led to another over the next 30, 40 years. I worked with a number of the psychedelic substances, including cannabis. I'm the editor and one of 18 contributors to a book called Cannabis and Spirituality. I've been co-organizing this conference in Vancouver for, I think this is my ninth. The conference is in its ninth year, and I've been involved from the beginning. So I've been involved with work with psychedelics in a spiritual context quite a lot over the course of my life.
So I don't know. I'm sure most people are aware if they've used the psychedelic, but why do you see the connection between spirituality and psychedelics? Where does that connection come from, and what are your thoughts around it?
Yeah, well, it comes from ancient history for starters. There's evidence all over the world in, archaeology and stuff like that, showing the use of these kinds of substances in spiritual work. And, so one could go into that a little bit, but for the purposes of our conversation, I would just say one kind of layperson's way of describing these substances is as non-specific or unspecific amplifiers. So basically what they do is they open up channels and really, let's be blunt about it. They are reality medicines. They're not drugs in that sense. It's not about escapism. It's not about avoiding reality or, creating any kind of dependent condition or anything like that. These substances are true. They're real if you use them properly. I mean, yes, they can be colorful and, all that sort of thing. But if you use them with the right knowledge, the right kind of context, container, etc., they have the potential to dissolve the boundaries of the known, you might say, and both function as truth serums to show us things about our lives and to open us up to a larger spiritual reality.
And substances meaning like mushrooms, psilocybin, ayahuasca, Ibogaine, things like that, or what's on that list for you that tells you that it's what are some of the ones you've seen that are effective?
Yeah, there are actually a lot of psychedelic plants on the planet, but yes, you've just named the main ones. I've worked with peyote in the Native American Church, LSD or acid, of course. Iboga is the actual root, the plant itself, or the psychoactive alkaloid Ibogaine. San Pedro is another one. It's very I think San Pedro is going to be much more prominent in the years to come. It's just getting started to be known outside of its traditional habitats in Peru and the surrounds down there. And
That's a cactus, right? The San Pedro cactus.
The psychoactive alkaloid is the same one that's in peyote, interestingly enough, even though their natural habitats do not overlap at all. That's mescaline. So there's, the mushrooms, of course, ayahuasca. There's a few others here and there. Some other ones that are developing increasing interest are these short-acting ones like DMT and perhaps with even more promise, 5-MeO DMT, which I haven't really had much experience with, just a kind of a semi-dose one time with 5-MeO, but there are a lot of people working with it up here in Vancouver, and what they're saying is that it tends to, it doesn't have quite the bizarre effects that DMT often has, but it can, enter one into what they call sometimes non-dual reality or awakening.
Yeah. So, what are the effects that you've experienced yourself, and what are the effects that you experienced maybe in being with people that were using these substances?
Yeah, when I was young, when I was much younger, I did them in some sloppy ways, but in the last 20 years or so, I've generally done these substances only in ritual context with people who know what they're doing. Well, with the Native American Church, for example, it's basically just, I can elaborate a little on what I said about them being non-specific amplifiers. They open up channels, and so they open up insight, into your own life and what you need to let go of to wake up spiritually, as it were. They actually potentially introduce you or invite you into a spiritual reality that's really unarguable, when you experience it. People who haven't experienced it might question it, but if you've experienced it, you don't. In the Native American Church, there's so many different things that can happen. In the Native American Church, for example, those are prayer meetings. And so people come in with an intention. There's a sponsor for the meeting generally. And that person has asked for help with something. It could be a very serious thing, an illness, an impending death, a recent death, or something lighter, like a birthday or an anniversary or like a gratitude meeting. But everybody in that teepee is praying for that person, and what the amplifying effect or the opening, deepening effect of the peyote is that people are able, ideally, to put their minds completely on that prayer. And believe it or not, I've heard elders, I was around for about a dozen years before some of the people I worked with passed away, and I kind of stopped going, but some of the elders that have been working with that medicine for 40 years or more were saying things like, when everyone can put their mind in the same place, when everyone can get out of their heads, get out of themselves in a sense, and just empty into that prayer, that intention is really the word, if you don't like the word prayer. He said, we have repeatedly seen what in conventional society would be called miracles, like a person coming into the teepee with a broken leg and walking out on two legs in the morning. That sort of thing can happen. They're just they open us up to what you might call an unconditional reality or truth. So that's immensely useful, as I understand it. When I say they do, they don't automatically do that. It depends on you and the situation that you're in.
So with the peyote ceremony, how many people would be there, and would everyone take peyote, or just the person that
No, everybody. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The very first time I went about 20 years ago, I was kind of nervous, and there were more native people than non-native like myself. And even among the non-native people, I felt like I was more of an outsider, like kind of a middle-class kid from Ontario that never had a drug addiction, whereas a lot of those people were there and are there because of, they've fallen off the rails, as it were, in one way or another. So I asked this one woman, I said, as we were about to go into the teepee, I said, any suggestions, or advice? She said, eat a lot of medicine. So, they all eat medicine. Yeah, they eat, they sing, and they pray.
And how long will those sessions last? How long will the effects of peyote affect everyone?
Well, they'll have second. They'll pass it around a couple of times over the course of the night. But the meetings typically start around 9 or 10 at night and go till about the same time in the morning. It's hard work, One of the elders that ran a lot of those meetings, they call that person a roadman. He said one time to the group, he said, relatives, you didn't come here to get comfortable. You came here to get strong. So, and they come from a lineage of tough people. I don't know how much you know about the native people of America, but a lot of those people were really damn tough, so that's kind of their conditioning almost, in some respects. And so they expect people to sit upright all night, not fidget a lot, not wander in and out of the teepee. It's the energy that's created by people staying focused and staying as still as possible that actually generates that power.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
30 to 40 people. There'll be 30 to, I didn't hear your last question. I'll just say there'll be 30, 40, 50 people in a teepee oftentimes. They're pretty big teepees. They have a fire in the middle, and that's a whole other thing in itself. They consider it sacred. They actually consider it a being,
Well, I'm just thinking of the typical, American or Canadian person, like I might help someone or help a neighbor, but, taking peyote and sitting there praying for, having intention for 12 hours is a big ask. It's a lot of work.
It is indeed, yes.
Well, I can see for very dire situations or, family members and super important prayers. Yeah, doing it. But
yeah, well, peyote is legal for use in this context, in the Native American Church context. And this is granted by the United States Congress, the highest legal approval available in the United States, and there's a reason for that. This is a culture that's been afraid of psychedelics in general, but they approve that because it's been shown repeatedly that it has life-changing capabilities for a very large number of people. There are probably close to 400,000 members of the Native American Church, primarily in the western half of the United States. And most of those people, as I say, have come in because their life had gone off the rails, and they find their life turns around when they, like I say, these medicines show you the truth. They show you, one of the things that it'll show you if you come in when, as a drug addict, an alcoholic, whatever, they'll show you the choice between, a destructive path and a positive path, and then it's your choice. They don't do it for you, obviously. It just shows you the truth. They're like the perfect guru, That's one of the reasons actually I got involved. I used to be involved with Tibetan Buddhist practice and study and teaching and so on for about 20 years. But I gravitated more toward working with these plants because they're like the guru that's incorruptible, absolutely incorruptible, and you can never doubt what they're saying because they're just sort of clear mirrors in that sense.
Well, have you seen people that go in skeptical and they're trying it just to disprove that it does anything? And does that work, or is it what happens to those kind of people?
Well, yeah, I don't know. I have to talk to them, I guess, but I would say, if you're in the right conditions and you surrender to it, yeah, you're going to see some things that you did not know before. That's the whole idea, If you resist, if you physically resist, you're going to have a really hard time, and you're going to go, oh, it's not for me, It depends on how kind of encrusted, you might say, your ego is, right? If you're not willing, this is what people say about all these substances, you have to surrender, you have to let go, you have to get out of your head. The bigger the dosage, the more powerful the substance, the less wiggle room you have, as it were. If you don't let go, you're going to have a really hard time. You can't remain in the flatland during the time that you're in that state.
So have you thought about ranking the different hallucinogens? And, if someone's going to first do an experience like this, what might be one that they would consider first, and what are for more advanced people that are used to, ego dissolution and the effects of these medicines?
Yeah, that's a good question, Richard. I don't know. Let me think. Cannabis is one way in. If people dismiss cannabis as a psychedelic or as a potentially powerful medicine, but if you do it in the right circumstances with the right kind of medicine and do a fairly strong dose, cannabis has, pretty much the same panoply of psychedelic potential effects as these other so-called major ones. But it also has this gentle potential as well, so you could, come in slowly that way and make it a gateway drug, as it were. Then I don't know what else to say about these other ones. Psilocybin mushrooms actually are pretty good ones to work with, again, because it's dose dependent. You can start with, a microdose. You can do a half of dried gram, 1 dried gram. Once you get up to about 2 grams, you're talking about a, most likely a pretty definite psychedelic effect. And Terence McKenna used to prescribe 5 dried grams. He called it a heroic or committed dose, where there's no question that the ego is going to be flattened. There will be no flat land left to try to skirt around what's going on there. This dissolution effect of the boundaries of your previous limits, as it were. So psilocybin, good one that way. I don't know. I think most people could probably handle ayahuasca in the right circumstances. LSD doesn't really have. There isn't really a ritual ceremonial environment going on for working with LSD, but there are more and more psychedelic psychotherapists coming along that are working with all these substances, and if you know enough about that person to trust them, then that's a pretty interesting way to enter into these kinds of situations.
Well, how do you know? Let's say you want help. How do you know which one to try? Is it just by luck? Oh, I know someone that can get peyote or versus Ibogaine or ayahuasca, and so that's what I'll do. How do people choose and end up with certain substances?
That's a really important question, Richard, as far as I'm concerned, because let's take ayahuasca, for example. There are, anyone can declare themselves it's called an ayahuasquero, or perhaps if you're a woman, you might call it an ayahuasquera. But, I think, here's a kind of a typical scenario that might happen. Somebody from the U.S. or Canada or somewhere goes down to Peru, finds an encampment in the jungle somewhere with an ayahuasquero in charge of the place, stays for a couple of months, maybe does 10, 15 ayahuasca ceremonies, and goes, I could come back to North America and, I think I know something, I could set myself up as an ayahuasquero. So I think there are a lot of people doing that around these days, and I'm pretty sure, I think it's safe to say that not all of them. Well, first of all, the traditional training for ayahuasqueros is rigorous and takes years. There's a lot to learn. I won't take the time to go into how that happens, but I've read enough about it to know that it's a pretty long and rigorous process to do it right. You have to get to know the medicine. You have to get to know yourself. You have to get to know the spirit of the medicine, and the songs that they say are actually downloaded. You don't make up these songs. They're healing songs that are taught to you by the spirits of the plants. You don't learn that in 2 or 3 months, So that's the starting point, lack of training or poor training. But then there are also these other potential issues of, ethical behavior. What is your motivation? Are you in it for money? Are you in it for power? Are you potentially a sexual predator? It's a really important question, and I'm not sure exactly what the answer is, except, finding out as much as you can about any particular person or scenario before you enter it, word of mouth, not just one maybe, but several, or people that let's say you know somebody really well and you really trust them and they've worked with this person for a while. That might be enough right there,
But is there a lexicon of effects? If you are dealing with depression, then this is better for you. Or if you're, addicted to drugs, this is better for you. Has anyone cataloged and found differences that one substance tends to work better for something else versus something?
Well, that's also an interesting question. It's a big question, really, because all of these substances have potential. I think I mentioned earlier the truth serum element of them. They're mirrors, and like ayahuasca, for example, can show people or take them back. Even sometimes they'll see it almost as if a movie reel has been pulled up in front of them. That a place where they were deeply wounded as a child, abandoned, or whatever happened, So just seeing that stuff and coming to terms with it can be extremely helpful. LSD was legal until the late 1960s. From its discovery in the early 1940s, there's a famous, at least in the worlds that I traveled in, a famous psychiatrist named Stanislav Grof, who before he moved to the States, I think in the 60s, was the head of a psychiatric hospital in Prague, Czechoslovakia, and administered over 5,000 therapeutic sessions, or oversaw, working with LSD. And, he's written a number of books and reports just unbelievable results working with psychiatric patients, because what it tends to do is take you to the central most damaging or the trauma of your life, and so you live through it. Sometimes people even smell things, like a guy will suddenly go, "What's that smell?" And oh, it's baby poo. He's been actually having a visceral relive of a traumatic time in his life, when he was a baby, or as Stan Grof says, much of this damage actually happens in the womb. And I could go on about that, but I won't. So basically, these substances can show you the places where you're blocked and so on. Mushrooms, for example, the psilocybin mushrooms, there's been a lot of wonderful, carefully controlled research, like clinical trials, I guess you could call them, or not even trials. They're not trying it out to, aiming toward legalization necessarily. They're I don't know what you call them, clinical studies, where they bring in real people and do real world administration of psilocybin, such as at Johns Hopkins University. This is one that got mainstream press back in the early 2000s, where they took, I don't know how many, 75, or I actually don't know the number of people, but a sizable number of people that they wanted to work with people with a terminal diagnosis, cancer in particular. And so they brought them in, and they did a lot of careful preparation, and they knew everything about their dosage, and they told people what to do if they got scared while they were in the midst of it. Just let go, keep trusting, and so on and so on. Just tried to do everything they could to make the people feel comfortable and safe. And the reports that came out of this were just, stunning, really. Many people had what they called mystical experiences. And the ones who had the most mystical experiences were the ones who changed their attitude about their lives the most. I'm not worried about dying anymore, because I saw the larger reality that we're all part of. We're not these individual, separated, isolated, struggling egos. We are part of the eternal creation of life altogether. And there's something completely reassuring about that you don't need to worry about that your body's going to die, because it's going to happen to everybody, right? Well, there's just a couple of examples. Iboga, you obviously know the name, so you might know a little bit about it, Richard, but it has this immense potential for working with addiction. Ibogaine in particular, the psychoactive, isolated psychoactive alkaloid of the plant, has been used in addiction treatment centers, and it has some remarkable capabilities that are perhaps unique. Yes, I would say unique in the sense that one thing that it does, not necessarily every single time, but it does do this often, is it somehow has a chemical or physiological effect that knocks out the craving for your drug. And what that does, it's not permanent. It gives you a window of time, perhaps 2, 3, 4 weeks, to change your life after that. And in one particular case, I just saw a movie recently called Dosed, which was a fascinating story of a woman who got out of a 20-year cycle of drug addiction using Iboga and Ibogaine. And part of the reason she was stuck in it, she was a very intelligent woman, educated woman actually, just kind of fell in that direction. And part of the reason that she had such a difficult time was because she couldn't, getting out of that lifestyle was she couldn't go through the withdrawal symptoms. She'd give up after a while because it was so painful. And the Iboga just knocked that right out, and she was able to have a few weeks with no withdrawal symptoms so that she could get clear of that. At the same time, it also does, Ibogaine also has this effect of showing you the truth or showing you the wounds of your childhood and all that kind of stuff. This particular woman in the film, Adrienne, spent at one point, the Ibogaine can last for days, and sometimes they'll repeat the process, so it can be like a week-long journey, For a couple of days, she reverted into an infantile state and relived a whole bunch of that stuff. So, all those things, Richard. Depression is often greatly aided by the effective use of some of these substances. Even there's a lot of, it's not proved in the science yet, but microdosing of some of them, like LSD and psilocybin mushrooms, has been showing a lot of anecdotal promise lately.
Well, this could be a really bad idea. I don't know. But again, if one were to catalog the effects of these different substances, if you could even do such a thing, has anyone tried using combinations of them? Let's say X amount is a dose of this substance, and Y is that. What if you did half of X and half of Y in a combination? Would that produce a different effect or a synergistic effect?
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying, yeah. Well, that's another interesting question, actually. I don't think a huge amount of it has been done, except cannabis can be quite supportive of a number of these things. What cannabis does, if you take it after another substance, and it, we're not fooling around here, because what it can do is it can potentiate the effects. It can actually make them much stronger. So you want to be aware of that, because we're already dealing with some pretty strong effects, of course. It can also, though, smooth the effects out a little without actually mitigating them. Excuse me. And a lot of people use, in some of these ritual environments, there's a religion called Santo Daime, which comes from Brazil and uses ayahuasca as their central sacrament. And some segments of that religion, or lineages, or whatever you call it, sometimes use cannabis. They call it Santa Maria at the end of the ceremony for their sharing sessions, because it tends to clarify at that point, and it helps people articulate what actually happened. Like mixing, say, ayahuasca and peyote, or I'm not seeing a lot of that going on myself. There may be, they have, I don't know. Personally, I would say when you're working with these major psychedelics, stick to one at a time. For a number of reasons. There are ritual containers. There are people who are experienced with helping you and working with them. Though the conventional society might laugh or roll their eyes, the native people, indigenous people, and many of the people who are outside that world originally but are now working with these substances say there are spirit energies that come in to work with you, and if you take ayahuasca and peyote in the same ceremony, then, who knows what you're dealing with at that point, right? So I wouldn't mess with that kind of concept very easily, with one other exception. MDMA, which is not actually a psychedelic, it's known as an empathogen or an entactogen, has this potential, again, used carefully with intention, therapeutic guidance or whatever, has a potential to open up the heart and bring insight and allow things to come up. That's used a lot for PTSD treatment and so on. Some people are combining that with things like LSD and some of these other substances, and that can work.
Are there antidotes for all these substances? Meaning, if you're having a bad trip, can you go to a hospital and get a drug that they could administer intravenously that would bring you down or take you out of the experience?
Yeah, they've got drugs for everything. Yeah, I believe so. I'm not an expert on that. I don't know specifically what drugs would do that, but yes, I'm pretty sure. But my guidance or my advice would be, don't go to the hospital. But for starters, don't put yourself into a situation where you're going to need to go to the hospital. Like if you just take these substances on your own, this ego dissolution capability can put you into some pretty frightening places. And the way that this work is beneficial is that you go through those. Having a bad time is not a bad sign. Some of the people that work with ayahuasca say their most difficult and painful trips were the most beneficial to them, because sometimes you just need to go through some stuff, but then you have to stay with it. This is at the Johns Hopkins thing. This is what they tell everybody going into the psilocybin sessions: is if you get frightened, don't buy into any kind of a story. Don't resist. Like, don't try to stop it. Just let go, surrender, trust, and then it'll change, and you'll go through it, and you'll come out the other side, and you just have to do that. So, I would just say don't ever take any of these substances in a situation where you're just left to your own devices, because they can show you the core realities of your life. They can show you stuff that's been buried your whole life. They can show you that you don't exist as a separate ego. This ego death. People say, "Oh, I'm dying." Yeah, you are dying, but your body isn't dying. It's your mind, your concept of yourself that's dying, right? But that's terrifying, and especially if nobody told you it would happen, right? So don't do it in those situations, folks. Please, do it with somebody you trust. As your question earlier, Richard, it's not easy necessarily to find the right circumstance, but it's important, and then go through it.
Have you talked to a lot of people that have gone through these experiences, or are you just there supporting the community of people that want to do it?
Yeah, I've been around it. I'm quite involved in it. As the co-organizer of this conference, for example, we're bringing in people to talk about these substances in the ways that I'm talking about with you today. How to use them safely, effectively, responsibly, with some kind of reciprocal responsibility toward the communities and the countries and cultures where some of the medicines come from. How to move them forward, so that they get recognition in therapeutic environments, legal recognition, and so on and so on. So, yeah, I know a fair number of people involved with these substances. I know therapists that are working with them, and different things like that, and ceremonial leaders that they're working with them, etc.
You've told me some already, I know, but any anecdotes from people or from yourself that really, really, you remember very strongly, that stick out to you, that you think are amazing or unusual?
Oh, boy. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, let me just tell you this one, since it comes to mind intuitively, so to speak. This is a woman I know quite well. She is an ayahuasquera, or I don't know if they have a feminine term for it, but anyway, she leads ayahuasca ceremonies. Been doing that for 7 or 8 years. She is a person who has taken that training very seriously. She's done. They do this thing where they dye it with different plants, so they get to know the spirit of the plant and can use it in their work. She's downloaded, the songs, et cetera, and she's just a really tuned in, sensitive kind of person. And what she told me was that this is not one experience. This is not a specific anecdote. This is a general her experience. She said that the visual material that a lot of people experience on ayahuasca is just the first layer. It's like ayahuasca 101. But when you penetrate beyond that, it's not so much about these kind of geometric and patterns and all that sort of thing. It's about actually connecting with spirit energies that can teach you things, that can show you things, and she has done that. Here's another. You can cut me off if we're running out of time, but this is my favorite situation or person these days in terms of spokesman for the central importance of these substances. And that's really what this is all about, by the way. And I could talk about that for 20 minutes, but I'll try to keep it under a minute here, is that the reason I'm so passionate about these psychedelics is because we absolutely need a major consciousness transformation on this planet if we're going to, survive in anything that doesn't look like a terribly dark dystopian future, and we don't know if we're gonna skirt that anyway, but we got a better chance if more of us wake up to who we really are and our connection to the planet and what's going on altogether in that regard, in the divine reality, if you will. So there's a guy named Chris Bache. It's pronounced spelled B-A-C-H-E. He has a book coming out this fall called LSD and the Mind of the Universe, Diamonds from Heaven. And this is no sort of, kind of new age, hippie-like guy or anything like that. He's a retired professor of religious studies and philosophy from Youngstown, Ohio, University of Ohio. And he used, I mentioned earlier, Stanislav Grof, and Chris used Stanislav Grof's protocol for private individual work. And over a course of 20 years, he did 73 high-dose LSD sessions, 500 to 600 micrograms, with a guide, with a carefully curated playlist of music, and with eye shades, and followed it up with meticulous journaling and note-taking the following day. And it would take me 10 minutes to really do him justice, but the long and the short of it is that after, he said every session had two parts. The first was about 2 hours and was often very difficult, sometimes, in his words, even exquisitely painful, as he let go of this any kind of identity with himself, any attachment to any aspect of himself, and saw his own faults and wounds and everything. Not something that most people would want to do or could even stay present with, but he did for some reason. And after about 2 hours, he every single time broke out into, I'm using my language now, something that I would call the living intelligence of the universe altogether. And they kept teaching him, and they kept teaching him at deeper and deeper levels. And ultimately, in the later sessions, in the sort of around, 15-year process of these 73 sessions, they started saying, your species is headed for a great awakening. But for that to happen, there has to be a great death, because the trajectory that the planet, the kind of dominating mind state of the planet is not sustainable. It's an illusion. We don't know who we are. We don't know what we're connected to, and we're disconnected, and so we're proceeding willy-nilly to destroy this planet right now. All that has to go. I mean, I don't know what has to go in the material realm exactly, but he's saying that there has to be an opening created for an awakening to happen. So it seems that we're going to go through. There's no timelines here, none of this 2012 stuff, They didn't give him any timelines, but they said that, what's likely to happen on this planet is that you've reached the end point of the karmic trajectory you're on. It's going to start breaking down increasingly, and as that happens, of course, all hell can break out. But there's also some spaces that are going to open up there, as the old ways fall apart, the old certainties, fall apart in some sense. There will be the possibility of a new vision that makes sense to people. There's I think it was, I don't know what he was exactly, a philosopher named Victor Hugo, who once said something to the effect of, there's nothing as powerful as an idea whose time has come. People are ready to hear. So and then Chris Beige talks about the birth of the new human, that this is going to be almost another species that's going to come out of this, that's not like, just sort of a random selection of, this kind of human. It's the real human, Homo noeticus, awakened human, So what the reason for the psychedelics is they open up those channels. They're the most direct source, the sort of uncorruptible guru, right? And that's what it's all about.
Okay. So what's the best way for people to find out more about this world? What do they read? Where do they go? What do they look at? What's your recommendations?
Yeah, good question. Well, there's one source that I have not looked at, but a bunch of my friends have. It's a subscription to Gaia TV or Gaia.com. And they have a lot of really interesting stuff, apparently. And one of them is they have a program, it's already completed, but it's still there, I believe, called Psychedelia. There's all kinds of information online. Again, it's caveat emptor, buyer beware. Decide for yourself. There's all kinds of discussion going on. Coming to conferences, quite frankly, it's not a sales pitch really, but our conference is an excellent way to get reliable information and also meet a lot of other people. I'm usually the MC of the conference, and one of the first things I say at the beginning is, "Hey, folks, doesn't matter how shy you are. Apart from listening to these presenters, the other thing that's going to make this useful weekend for you is to go and meet people. Like every time there's a break, walk up to somebody and introduce yourself. And and then you find out what other people are doing and all. This is an excellent way to find out where reliable guidance is for working with these substances. Is go to a conference like ours and read books. Read books. There's some really good books. Read Chris Bache's book when it comes out, LSD and the Mind of the Universe. There's a lot of good literature out there on these things. Bill Richards he was involved. He was one of the investigators that did the Johns Hopkins stuff that I mentioned earlier. He's coming to speak at the conference this year, and he has a really interesting book, very, very reliable information called Sacred Knowledge, published in 2016 from State University of New York Press. And then, when you find something that you feel, and you have to trust your intuition too. This is like, Ernest Hemingway's old thing, make sure your bullshit detector is working, right? Because there are people, who don't know what they're doing or are doing it for the wrong reasons, and so on and so on. But once you find something that, you can rely on, then go for it, There's much to be learned. There's much to be gained. There's no doubt whatsoever about that. And this is not dogma. This is experience of so many people speaking.
Well, very good. Well, Stephen, thank you for coming. It's been an interesting experience, and I hope that people that are listening that are interested, find out what they want to find out and explore this realm. It's very different and instructive.
Right. Sure. Happy to discuss it anytime.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.